Hi there, this is Daniel Kirsch, and welcome to this lecture on U.S. politics and government that has to do with, um, remember the modules are the who, what, when, where, why, and how of American politics, and this is the where. And so within this module, we've been talking about federalism and, um, and the relationship of the states to the federal government. And this particular lecture is going to be about what makes California politics unique to U.S. politics. So, one thing I want to go over is the fact that, of course, California is a state. So all the things that apply to a state that we've already discussed and that you've already seen in other lectures and read in the textbook and seen in your Canvas links. There's some things that make California unique, and a lot of things that make California unique. Um, and one of the things that happens to be prominent in the news in 2021 is that the governor, who's a Democrat currently, is being subjected to a recall effort by his Republican opponents. And recalls have an interesting history, especially an interesting recent history in California politics. They, along with propositions, are one of the kind of political legal distinctions between California and many other states that simply don't exist in the same way around the United States. So a recall is this effort to say that, you know, the spirit of it, a recall has been to say, well, the person we elected to fill out their term has simply not done the job that we wanted them to. And the person is usually in California politics, and at least in terms of this effort, is the governorship has really been subjected to recalls more often because they seem to be a more prominent political actor. They certainly control financially and economically, or I should say influence more financially and economically than almost any other political actor in the state. So it seems to be a natural kind of political target, and also the fact that it's probably the most prominent executive actor in the U.S. Next to the president, simply because it's the largest U.S. state, and the governor is the executive officer of the state government. So what does all that mean in this context? Well, recalls have been. There was one that was successful about 20 years ago, not quite 20 years ago, when Governor Gray Davis who was also a Democrat, was subjected to a Republican recall effort. And the recall effort was built around the lack of satisfaction people had around these rolling blackouts that had started to happen. And it was found out later on, not too much longer after that, just a few years, that the company Enron through their kind of financial manipulation of the energy markets, had been really facilitating these rolling blackouts in a way that was disingenuous, and that certainly, when it came to light, was thought to be at least one of the kind of crimes they perpetrated on the American public. And so that was not known at the time in 2003. It was just known that, the governor somehow couldn't get it together to get the, power utilities to stop turning people's power off for, different periods of time. And as a result of that recall effort, what happened at the same time, because during a recall, two things happen. They ask you a question on the ballot: do you want to recall this elected official? And if a majority say yes, 50% plus one say yes, then that person is recalled. But then simultaneously, there is another question that's asked. So there have to be people who are running to replace that governor if that governor is recalled. And so in 2003 that happened. And whoever gets the most votes wins, which is different from a normal election. In a normal election, in California, there is a primary election, and then there is a top two election, a runoff. And the primary election happens. when that primary election happens, it doesn't matter if both people are Democrats or both people are Republicans, or if there's a Democrat and a Republican, or a Democrat and a Green Party member, or whatever. Whoever the top two people are, then that third person, then there's no third person on the ballot in the second round, and you have to choose one or the other. And that's the way that in that runoff, someone gets 50% plus one votes, a majority. That's a normal election. In a recall election, once 50% plus one has been surpassed to recall a governor, then in the other simultaneous election that happens, even if someone gets 41% of the vote, as long as that was more than what everyone else got, if there was someone who got 29% and someone who got 14% and someone who got 5% and like 10 people who got 5%, doesn't matter. Whoever got 41% wins. And that's what happened in 2003. Gray Davis, I think, was recalled with something like 52% of the vote. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was essentially the Republican candidate, there were no other prominent Republican candidates running at the same time as him. He received something like 48% of the vote. And so he didn't have to face a runoff because it was a recall. And that's how he was elected the first time. He was elected in 2003, really shortly after Gray Davis's re-election in, I think, 2002. It must have been, it must have been 2002, because that's when California elections are, is during midterms. So only a year into his second term, Gray Davis was subjected to this recall, and so he didn't get a chance to serve out the rest of his term. And Arnold Schwarzenegger was able to serve another, I believe, 8 years. I'm not sure if he was reelected twice in his own right. I think he was. I think he might have been, I think maybe he just served the rest of that term and then one other term. So he might have been only governor for about 7 years. So he had never been elected to anything before. He was just a prominent, activist and certainly an actor. Anyway, so we can go into a lot about Arnold Schwarzenegger, I suppose. But that's the last time a recall happened. And so this time, what's being framed is that Gavin Newsom, the current governor, is there's a recall effort. But that recall effort, you might note, has been going on since well before the pandemic. But it's picked up steam since the pandemic because of the confusion of the pandemic, and not to make any sort of case for Gavin Newsom or not, but certainly any sort of public relations mistakes that he's made have been magnified, and certainly not everyone was in agreement with many of the lockdown measures that he kind of took a leadership role on. So it's up to you how you feel about that, but the point is that it was, he made a point that I thought was a salient one recently, that most of the time the people who are seeking petitions, who try to get you to sign a petition in order to get the recall on the ballot, and that's something I left out, a recall effort only works if you get a certain number of signatures to agree that a recall should happen, and then you can put it on the ballot. And so the state has to allow that recall effort by people who start a petition and get enough petition signatures. And I don't know the number, but it's in the millions. I think it's over like 1.5 million, something like that. And I'll amend this later if that's the case, if I'm wildly inaccurate. But let's say you get 1.5 million signatures, or whatever the number is, and you have to. The state then has to allow, as long as those signatures are valid, has to allow that recall effort to take place. So what's been acknowledged recently by Newsom and the California Democratic Party is this recall effort is likely to be on the ballot, and whether or not it's successful is another matter. So they're basically treating this like another election campaign, and which is a resource drain for the Democratic Party, and much more so than the Republican Party, I would say, who is usually more resourced in any state. And but whether that's the case or not, the point is that there's likely to be a recall effort in the fall of 2021, but then also a scheduled regular gubernatorial election, we call them, in 2022. So in just another year. So we're kind of now seeing a roughly 2 year re-election campaign for Gavin Newsom, or to put it another way, a 2 year political battle for the governorship between the Democrats and the Republicans, that's being initiated at least in early on by the Republican Party, because they're out of power, and that's that's what political parties do. But this is something that their motivation for this clearly took place before the pandemic, but has become somewhat animated by the increased kind of unpopularity of various lockdown measures during the pandemic. So, in addition to recalls, there's another prominent piece of California political culture, and that is propositions. And these propositions are something that you see on the ballot just about every other year during major elections. And propositions, are thought to be democratic, kind of this direct democracy tradition that began really in 1911 with the governor at the time, and this kind of culture of political propositions is somewhat is interesting. I don't really know how to characterize it, but is definitely particular to California, in the sense that every election year there are very prominent organizations, statewide political organizations, that become involved in attempting to pass these propositions that otherwise would be just bills that are passed in the legislature. And sometimes, and I could give you a lot of examples, and I don't think that I should at this point, but there are examples of many different laws that were passed by initiative and referendum, by proposition, in California, that at first were passed by the legislature and then were reversed by initiative and referendum by this process. But one thing that I will mention, that two examples that are very historically significant, are Proposition 13 and Proposition 209. And Proposition 13 was definitely aided by, I would say, Southern California homeowners and businesses that were seeking to reduce their property tax bills, because as California became more a source of investment, and their values of their homes and their businesses were increasingly valued at the local level, these valuations came to be a source of tax revenue, especially for local schools. And so this was a kind of slow progression that occurred, but suddenly in the 1970s, a group of taxpayer activists decided to place Proposition 13 on the ballot. And Proposition 13 essentially said that you could only be taxed on the value of your home at the time that you purchased it. And so it didn't matter how much your home increased in value during the entire length of when you owned it. It could only, raise something like 2% a year. And so basically it froze or significantly reduced the number of schools that could operate in California. And so California very quickly went from one of the top per capita pupil spending rates in the U.S. to, ranked 1 out of 50, to something like 49th out of 50 per capita pupil spending. So, and a lot of schools had to immediately close because their funding sources simply were not sufficient to justify the existence of a school. And so there have been a lot of propositions that have been passed as kind of addendums to funding and local variances of to get around Proposition 13 somewhat. But it's kind of an iron law at this point of California politics that Proposition 13 is here to stay. And there was an attempt recently to amend it to say that we're gonna we will tax businesses and not homeowners, but we will tax businesses at a higher rate, certainly at the rate that they're closer to what their property is currently worth than when they bought it. But that failed as well. And And so Proposition 13. So a lot of people have bought property since the 1970s and have engaged in real estate investment and even speculation that that you could say is very much tied to the reality of only having to pay a certain amount of tax. And so it's arguable that there's been some real estate growth and thus economic growth in California that is at least based on the presupposition of Proposition 13 being a legal reality. So to upend it would have pretty drastic ramifications, I think, or could, if it were reversed. But at this point, it doesn't seem like it's going to be reversed. So embedded is it in the political popular opinion of most voters and taxpayers in California. Another proposition that was passed in 1994, Proposition maybe 96, was Proposition 209. And Proposition 209 essentially banned affirmative action and racial quotas in not only college admissions, but any government activities that the California government had to engage in. So they made the case, and they called it the South California Civil Rights Initiative. They made the case that racial quotas are a form of reverse discrimination, and there was recently an attempt to repeal it in, I believe, 2020, and then again it failed to gain 50% plus one, so it also failed, and it actually failed pretty miserably, and so similar numbers took place this time than as did 20 plus years ago. So I want to just sidetrack here for a second to say that those are maybe two of the most prominent examples you could cite when talking to friends across the country or in other parts of the country or the world who say that California is inherently some kind of a liberal state or reliably democratic or much more leftist than the rest of the country is. And that's simply not the case, or at least there's a case to be made that it's not accurate because of votes that take place like that. And I believe it was 2008 when there was this was before the Supreme Court decision when same-sex marriage was banned in California by a majority vote during a proposition. I believe that was Proposition 8. So there have been a lot of propositions that, aided by public relations campaigns that are well funded, are able to undermine what people think will be a relatively simple position that maybe liberal Californians will take. But very often they are simply not able to, liberals are simply not able to match the public relations funding that conservative funders are able to amass and able to kind of wield in their commercial and airwaves battles. But look very, not so closely. I would say that there's a lot of good resources out there for looking. Every time there's a proposition, you should always at least read the groups that are endorsing any of these, and any groups that you tend to align yourself with and mostly agree with in California politics. You should take a look and see, next time you vote and you receive that voter guide in the mail, which everyone does, you should look and see what groups endorse, what propositions. And if you're not willing to read or engage in what these propositions are, you can get a good guide to how people like you feel about it just by reading just those voter guides, and then maybe even turning to the voter guide of that group you agree with and seeing what they think about the propositions. Let's see. The legislature is something I want to mention relatively quickly. There are term limits in the legislature. I believe you can only serve 12 years total in the legislature. And in the Senate, you get a 4-year term, and in the Assembly, you get a 2-year term. And, because it's such a compressed time period that you're able to have a career, people like Toni Atkins, the woman who is currently Senate president, she's the first woman to be an openly gay Senate president, but she also, the first woman, I think, and she also was the first woman to be openly gay as the Assembly Speaker. So the Assembly and the Senate are the kind of California equivalent to the U.S.'s House and Senate. But in California, the Senate terms are not 6 years; they're 4 years, and the Assembly terms are 2 years, which is the same as a member of Congress. But a Senate seat is about the same as maybe a little larger than a U.S. congressional seat currently, because I believe there's 60 votes in the Senate, if I'm not mistaken, and in the Assembly, I believe there's about 120. So yeah, so there's in the Assembly and the Senate, they're in Sacramento, and they are mostly people who are community leaders, and once they're elected and they kind of serve out their terms in the Senate and the Assembly, many become lobbyists, but some run for higher office. The people who are lobbyists work for either large financial firms or Silicon Valley firms, or potentially large real estate, construction, or agriculture firms, or take them on as clients. And the reason lobbying is such a lucrative industry for people who are former members of the legislature is simply because members of the legislature listen more to people who have been in their shoes potentially, and they have a tendency to listen more to people who are a former representative or a former senator than just someone who is an ordinary, let's say, lawyer for an oil and gas company, or a lawyer for a construction company. If that lawyer for a construction company also happens to be a good friend of theirs from when they served in the same committee, then that lobbyist is likely to be able to persuade that other member of the legislature more often than not. Okay, so that's the legislature, and their budget is something that I would encourage you to look at, and the video that I'll use to accompany this is something that you should see as well. And it's the closest thing I can find to a California politics textbook for free. It's kind of how the budget works. And the budget is subject to multiple revisions and negotiations, but essentially it's agreed upon annually, the same way the U.S. Congress's budget is, through the Assembly and the Senate, and the governor has to sign it. And so those three are in constant negotiations from January until June, when the budget is normally finalized. Very quickly, there is, of course, a great degree of racial and ethnic diversity in the state, with a much higher Latinx and Asian American population in California than virtually any other state in the nation. And to put a fine point on it, the non-Latinx white population is about 40% of the overall population, and the Latinx part of the population is more than that. It's about 41%, I believe, and I believe 5% Black, and something like, it might be 5 or 10% Asian American. So the rest of the statistics I'm not as clear on, but it is the only state in the union that has a higher Latinx population than non-Latin white population. And so that fuels a lot of the kind of political controversy and understanding in the state, and the kind of racial and ethnic politics and vocabulary that you hear is different in California, simply because the proportionality racially and ethnically is somewhat different. But as far as regional distinctions are concerned, that's something I want to at least make clear, that there are several parts of California, as you all know, and I want to leave you with this, that California's Central Valley has only 1% of the U.S.'s farmland, but produces 8% of its food. And so there's a huge kind of output of agriculture, which is a huge part of the state in the Central Valley. But also the Silicon Valley area is a huge economic powerhouse for the rest of the country. And as we know, kind of Southern California and LA is this, has been an entertainment mecca, but is increasingly a kind of gentrified and tourist destination, more so than an actual entertainment destination. So different parts of the state have different economic engines, but they all are kind of suffering from an increased cost of living and increased real estate costs for new home buyers and renters and the middle class. And so there's not an exponential exodus out of California, but it is very probable that California will lose at least one congressional seat in the next round of the census that has already taken place. So we'll see what that is next year. Okay, so I'm about out of time, but if you want to talk more about California politics, I urge you to talk to me during class, and hopefully we'll have more comments on this during the essay portion of your final essay, and we can certainly have a more robust discussion during our class meeting time. Thanks for watching.